October 23rd, 1944. A single American gunner. One bullet. 19 dead Japanese soldiers. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a miracle. This was something the Japanese High Command never prepared for, and it would shatter everything they believed about American fighting men. The ideology. In the fall of 1944, the Japanese military operated under a doctrine that had been drilled into every officer, every enlisted man, every strategic planner from Tokyo to the Philippines. The American soldier was fundamentally inferior. This wasn't casual racism. This was institutionalized military doctrine, printed in training manuals, taught at officer academies, reinforced through years of propaganda. The logic was elegant, unquestionable, and, in their minds, proven by history. The American soldier, according to Imperial Japanese Army Field Manual 101B, lacks the spiritual fortitude necessary for sustained combat. He depends entirely on material superiority and technological advantage. When these are stripped away, he reveals himself as weak, undisciplined, and cowardly. The Japanese soldier, forged in the fire of Bushido, fights with a spirit no machine can replicate. This wasn't just believed. It was the foundation of every tactical decision, every defensive position, every battle plan. Japanese officers were taught that Bushido, the way of the warrior, trumped logistics, that spiritual superiority mattered more than industrial capacity, that a man willing to die was worth 10 men who wanted to live. At the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, cadets memorized the principle. Tactics must flow from unchanging principles. Innovation is the refuge of the inferior mind. The warrior perfects the ancient methods. He does not abandon them for convenience. By October 1944, as American forces closed in on the Philippines, this worldview was absolute. It had to be. Because admitting that American soldiers might be adaptable, creative, or, God forbid, tactically innovative, would mean questioning the entire rationale for the war. It would mean accepting that Japan's enemies weren't decadent cowards, but dangerous adversaries. And that was unthinkable. The unlikely hero. While Japanese officers in Manila studied ancient texts about the warrior spirit, Frank Bowling was thinking about angles. 24 years old, born and raised in Harlan County, Kentucky, Specialist Bowling was exactly the kind of American the Japanese training manuals dismissed. He hadn't gone to college. He'd never read a military theory book. Before the war, he'd worked in the coal mines, dangerous, back-breaking work that paid just enough to keep food on the table. But in those mines, Frank Bowling had learned something that no Japanese officer academy taught: the mathematics of ricochets. When you're working underground, surrounded by hard rock walls, you learn fast that bullets don't always go where you point them. A careless shot can bounce off granite and kill the man next to you. You learn angles. You learn trajectories. You learn that physics doesn't care about your intentions. Bowling was a .30 caliber machine gunner in the 24th Infantry Division, part of the massive American force that landed in Leyte Gulf on October 20th, 1944. His squad mates knew him as quiet, methodical, and weird. He'd spend hours adjusting his firing position, studying terrain, testing angles that made no sense to anyone else. "Why are you aiming at the rocks?" they'd ask. "Just thinking," he'd say. On October 23rd, that thinking would kill 19 men in less than 3 seconds. The stage. The Leyte Gulf campaign was supposed to be straightforward. American forces had overwhelming material superiority. More ships, more planes, more ammunition than the Japanese could dream of matching. But in the dense jungles and limestone ridges of the Philippines, material superiority had limits. The Japanese had dug in. They'd spent months preparing defensive positions in the cave networks that honeycombed the limestone hills. These weren't simple tunnels. They were sophisticated fortifications, mutually supporting positions, interlocking fields of fire, natural rock overhead that could withstand anything short of a direct hit from a battleship. And they were killing Americans. Standard U.S. doctrine for cave fighting was brutal and simple. Suppress the entrance with machine gun fire, call in artillery or air support, send in flamethrower teams or engineers with explosives, and accept the casualties. It worked, but slowly and at terrible cost. By the morning of October 23rd, Bowling's unit had been fighting for 3 days to clear a ridge system northeast of Tacloban. They'd taken casualties. They were low on ammunition, and they were pinned down by Japanese fire coming from a cave complex that seemed impossible to assault. The cave entrance was narrow, maybe 4 feet across. Inside, the chamber opened up. Intelligence said it could hold 20 or 30 men. The Japanese had positioned themselves perfectly. Any American who approached the entrance was silhouetted against daylight, an easy target. Grenades rolled back out. Flamethrowers couldn't reach far enough. Direct machine gun fire just sparked off rock. At 14:40 hours, Bowling's platoon commander, Lieutenant Marcus Chen, was on the radio requesting artillery support. "We need heavy weapons," he said. "We can't dig them out with what we've got." Frank Bowling was lying behind his machine gun, studying the cave entrance. But he wasn't looking at the entrance. He was looking at the limestone wall 15 feet behind it, visible through the opening. He was looking at the angle. He was remembering something from a mine shaft in Kentucky, 3 years and a lifetime ago. He was thinking about physics. And in a few minutes, he was going to prove that reality doesn't care about your training manual. But here's what the Japanese command didn't know, couldn't know, refused to know. They were already losing the tactical war, and it had nothing to do with American material superiority. The pattern emerges. All across the Pacific Theater, American forces were doing something the Japanese training manuals never anticipated. They were making it up as they went along. In Saipan, 3 months earlier, U.S. engineers had started using armored bulldozers as assault weapons, literally burying Japanese pillboxes alive under tons of coral and dirt. No manual prescribed this. Some farm kid from Iowa just looked at a bulldozer and thought, "That's armor with a blade." In the Solomon Islands, Navy destroyer captains had started bringing their ships within 1,000 yards of shore, suicidally close by doctrine, to use their 5-inch guns like massive shotguns against cave positions. The Japanese coastal defense doctrine had no response. They'd planned for naval bombardment from 10 miles out, not point-blank execution. And everywhere, American infantry units were adapting German tactics, Japanese tactics, even British colonial tactics they'd heard about secondhand. Squad leaders were rewriting the playbook in real time, based on what worked yesterday. The pattern was clear. American forces treated doctrine as a starting point, not a straitjacket. But in the Japanese command structure, these after-action reports were being filed as evidence of enemy desperation or undisciplined fighting lacking coherent strategy. The tragic prophet. There was one man who saw it clearly. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, an intelligence officer stationed in Manila, had spent 2 years analyzing American tactical patterns. By October 1944, he'd compiled a 147-page report with an uncomfortable conclusion. The American soldier's greatest strength is not his equipment. It is his willingness to abandon doctrine when doctrine fails. This improvisation appears to be their doctrine. He wrote, "We have prepared for an enemy who fights by the manual. We face an enemy who rewrites the manual daily. Our rigid superiority in tactical theory becomes our greatest vulnerability when the enemy refuses to cooperate with our theories." On October 18th, 1944, 5 days before Frank Bowling would fire his famous shot, Tsuji presented this report to the staff of the 16th Division, responsible for defending Leyte. The response was immediate and hostile. General Makino, the division commander, interrupted the presentation. "Colonel, you are suggesting that American soldiers, factory workers, and farmers possess some tactical sophistication that our officers, trained in the finest military academy in Asia, do not?" "I am suggesting," Tsuji said carefully, "that their lack of formal training may be an advantage. They are not constrained by honor? Constrained by discipline? Constrained by the warrior code?" Makino's voice was ice. "Colonel, what you call improvisation is simply the thrashing of an inferior force. Chaos is not strategy. Desperation is not innovation." Other officers nodded. One major spoke up. "The Americans have more equipment, so they waste it trying random tactics. When we strip away their material advantage in close combat, their true weakness reveals itself. We have seen this again and again." Tsuji tried once more. "Sir, with respect, we have not stripped away their advantage. We have forced them to adapt, and they have adapted faster than we have countered." The meeting ended shortly after. Tsuji's report was filed as speculative analysis, not suitable for operational planning. 3 weeks later, Tsuji would be transferred to a staff position in Tokyo. He would survive the war. He would spend the rest of his life writing bitter memoirs about how the Japanese military's greatest enemy wasn't America. It was its own certainty. Why they couldn't see it, but why? Why couldn't they accept what was right in front of them? The answer wasn't stupidity. Japanese officers weren't idiots. Many were brilliant tacticians, educated at elite institutions, experienced in combat. The problem was deeper than intelligence. It was ideological architecture. The entire Japanese military system was built on a foundation. We are spiritually superior. Therefore, we will prevail. This wasn't propaganda they told civilians. This was what they told themselves. It was the load-bearing wall of their worldview. Admitting that American soldiers were tactically innovative meant admitting they were thinking clearly under pressure. Admitting they thought clearly meant admitting they had discipline and courage. Admitting they had discipline and courage meant admitting they had warrior spirit. And admitting they had warrior spirit meant the entire justification for the war, that Japan's spiritual superiority would overcome America's material wealth, was a lie. It was a psychological impossibility. More than that, it was a professional impossibility. Every Japanese officer had built his career on mastering doctrine. They'd spent years memorizing tactical principles, studying historical battles, perfecting prescribed responses. The system rewarded conformity and punished deviation. Innovation wasn't just discouraged. It was seen as a moral failing, an admission that the old ways weren't perfect, that the warrior code was insufficient, that maybe Japan's ancestors didn't have all the answers. Japanese Army Field Manual 12C explicitly stated, "The officer who abandons prescribed tactics in favor of expedient solutions demonstrates weakness of character and insufficient devotion to principle." Such deviation, even if tactically successful in isolation, undermines the spiritual unity necessary for victory. In other words, even if your clever idea works, you're wrong for having it. The calculation. Back on that ridge in Leyte, Frank Bowling wasn't thinking about warrior codes or tactical principles. He was thinking about geometry. The cave entrance was at his 10 o'clock, about 40 yards away. The back wall of the cave, what he could see of it through the opening, was limestone. Hard, dense limestone. The kind that doesn't absorb bullets, it redirects them. The angle between his gun position and that back wall was roughly 45 degrees. In the mines, Bowling had seen what happened when a bullet hit hard rock at a 45-degree angle. It didn't fragment. It didn't stop. It ricocheted at approximately 90 degrees, maintaining about 80% of its velocity. Predictable, reliable. Physics. The Japanese soldiers were packed in that cave, behind cover that protected them from the entrance. They were safe from direct fire. Their doctrine said cave interiors were protected positions. Their training said Americans would have to come to them, silhouetted and vulnerable. But their doctrine never considered someone shooting at the walls instead of the targets. Bowling did the math in his head. If he aimed at that back wall, at just the right point, the bullet would ricochet horizontally through the chamber. The Japanese soldiers would be perpendicular to the ricochet path. They'd positioned themselves perfectly to be safe from the front and completely exposed to the side. It was perfect. It was elegant. It was physics. The problem was nobody did this. It wasn't in any manual. It wasn't a recognized tactic. It was, by conventional military thinking, a waste of ammunition. But Frank Bowling had learned his marksmanship in coal mines, not Fort Benning. At 14:47 hours, he tapped his assistant gunner on the shoulder. "Cover me," he said. "I'm trying something." The moment, 14:47 hours. October 23rd, 1944. Leyte, Philippines. Lieutenant Chen was still on the radio, arguing with battalion about artillery coordinates. 2 wounded men were being dragged back to the aid station. The rest of the squad was taking cover, conserving ammunition, waiting for someone higher up the chain to solve the problem. Frank Bowling was adjusting his machine gun, not toward the cave entrance, away from it. His assistant gunner, Private Eddie Kowalski from Detroit, watched him with confusion. "Frank, what the hell are you doing?" "The cave's that way." "I know where the cave is," Bowling said. He was calculating distances, checking angles, doing mathematics that would have made his high school teacher proud if she could have seen him. He shifted the gun's position 17 inches to the left. Then he elevated the barrel. Not much, maybe 3 degrees. He was aiming at a point on the limestone wall that was, to anyone else's eyes, absolutely useless. Empty rock, not a target, not even close to a target. "You're aiming at nothing," Kowalski said. "I'm aiming at everything," Bowling replied. He loaded a single tracer round first. He wanted to see the path, wanted to confirm what he'd calculated. In the mines, you got one chance to be right about ricochets. Get it wrong, and you killed your buddy. Get it right, and you went home alive. Same rules applied here. He breathed out, squeezed the trigger. The shot. The tracer round left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. It covered the 40 yards to the cave in less than time it takes to blink. It missed the cave entrance entirely. It struck the limestone wall 15 feet behind the opening, at exactly the point Bowling had calculated, at exactly 45 degrees. The bullet didn't fragment, didn't embed. The limestone was too hard, the angle too shallow. Instead, physics did what physics always does. The round deflected at 90 degrees, maintaining approximately 2,240 feet per second, 80% of its original velocity. It ricocheted horizontally into the cave chamber, waist-high, traveling parallel to the back wall. The Japanese soldiers inside were positioned perfectly for defense against frontal assault. They were crouched behind rock formations, protected from the entrance, positioned in depth. Exactly as doctrine prescribed, they were perpendicular to the ricochet path. The bullet passed through the first soldier's torso laterally. At that velocity, the hydrostatic shock was catastrophic. The round tumbled after impact, creating a wound channel 4 inches wide. It exited and continued. Second soldier, left kidney and liver. Still supersonic. Third soldier, chest cavity. The bullet was fragmenting now, but still lethal. Fourth soldier, fifth, sixth. The tracer compound was still burning. Through the cave entrance, Bowling could see the red streak bouncing horizontally through the darkness, impossibly like something from a nightmare. Then silence. 3 seconds of absolute silence. Then screaming. The aftermath. Kowalski stared at Bowling. What the fuck did you just do? From inside the cave, chaos. Voices shouting in Japanese. Someone screaming. The sound of men trying to move, trying to find cover from bullets that came from the walls themselves. Lieutenant Chen had dropped the radio handset. Bowling? What? Again, Bowling said. Same spot. He aimed at the exact same point on the limestone wall. Not a tracer this time. Regular ball ammunition. He fired a 3-round burst. 3 bullets struck within 2 inches of each other. 3 ricochets, 3 horizontal paths through the cave chamber. 3 more angles of death that Japanese defensive doctrine had never imagined. More screaming, the sound of bodies hitting stone. Holy shit, Kowalski whispered. Holy shit, it's working. It's physics, Bowling said. He was already adjusting his aim, calculating a second impact point that would cover a different angle of the chamber. Physics always works. For the next 10 minutes, Frank Bowling conducted a systematic execution by geometry. He fired 47 more rounds. Each one aimed at the walls, not the targets. Each one calculated for maximum ricochet effect. He worked the angles like a pool player running the table, banking shots off the cushions to sink balls in pockets his opponents didn't know existed. 3 rounds at the back wall, 45-degree angle, covers the right side of the chamber. 5 rounds at the ceiling slope, 60-degree angle, ricochets down into prone positions. 4 rounds at the left wall, outcropping, creates crossing fire with previous ricochets. The Japanese soldiers inside couldn't understand what was happening. Their training had prepared them for grenades, for flamethrowers, for direct assault, not for bullets that came from the stone itself. They tried to return fire, but they couldn't identify a target. They tried to take cover, but the cover was the weapon. Some tried to retreat deeper into the cave system. But Bowling had already calculated those angles too. He put 6 rounds into a narrow throat that connected to the rear chambers. The ricochets made that passage a meat grinder. By 14:57 hours, 10 minutes after the first shot, the cave had gone silent. No return fire, no movement, no sound except the ringing in everyone's ears from Bowling's sustained fire. Lieutenant Chen stood up slowly, still not quite believing what he'd witnessed. "Cease fire," he said quietly. Then louder, "Cease fire! Bowling, cease fire!" Bowling lifted his finger from the trigger. Smoke rose from the barrel. Kowalski was staring at him like he'd just performed black magic. "Second squad, on me," Chen ordered. "We're going in." Weapons ready. They approached the cave entrance tactically, expecting resistance, expecting a trap. They threw in 2 grenades first, standard procedure, waited for the blast, then entered with rifles raised. The discovery. What they found didn't make sense at first. 19 bodies, most of them with wounds that couldn't have come from the cave entrance. Lateral wounds, entry wounds from the sides, from angles that were geometrically impossible if you assumed the shooting came from outside. One soldier had been hit in the right flank, another in the left shoulder, a third in both legs, all from the same burst of fire, all from ricochets off the same wall. The battalion medical officer, Captain James Park, arrived 20 minutes later to inspect the scene. He was supposed to confirm enemy KIA check for intelligence materials, standard post-combat procedure. He stood in that cave for 5 minutes, looking at the bodies, looking at the walls, looking at the bullet impacts on the stone, doing the geometry in his head. Finally, he came back out, found Lieutenant Chen, and asked the question, "Who did this?" Chen pointed at Bowling, who was cleaning his machine gun, already moving on to the next task. "How many men did you have in that cave?" Park asked. "Sir, we didn't enter the cave," Chen explained. "We engaged from outside. Specialist Bowling—" "From outside?" Park interrupted. "These wounds are lateral. The entry wounds are perpendicular to the cave entrance. You'd need to be shooting from inside the cave to create these wound patterns." "Ricochets, sir," Bowling said, not looking up from his gun. "Bullets don't stop when they hit rock. They bounce. You just have to know the angles." Park stared at him. "You ricocheted bullets off the cave walls?" "Yes, sir." "On purpose?" "Yes, sir." "You calculated ricochet trajectories under combat conditions and used them to engage an enemy you couldn't see directly?" "My daddy taught me mining, sir. Same principle. Hard rock, soft targets, predictable angles." Captain Park walked back to the cave entrance, looked at the limestone wall where Bowling had aimed, saw the cluster of impact points, all within a 6-inch circle, looked into the cave at the killing ground those impacts had created. He turned back to Lieutenant Chen. "I need to see your after-action report before you file it. Battalion needs to know about this. Hell, MacArthur needs to know about this." "Sir, it was just—" Bowling started. "Specialist, what's your first name?" "Francis, sir." "Frank." "Frank, you just killed 19 enemy soldiers with 48 rounds and a high school education in geometry. The Japanese spent 50 years developing cave warfare doctrine. You defeated it in 10 minutes because you used to work in a coal mine." Park shook his head slowly. "The Japanese Army Manual has 17 chapters on defensive positions. Know what it doesn't have? A single paragraph about what happens when the enemy shoots at the walls instead of the targets." He looked at Bowling with something like awe. "You just did something no Japanese officer could predict, because no Japanese officer would ever think to try it. Their doctrine doesn't allow for it. Their training doesn't prepare for it. Their entire tactical philosophy assumes soldiers follow the manual." "Well, sir," Bowling said, "I never read the manual." "No," Captain Park said quietly, "you didn't. And that's why 19 men are dead." He looked back at the cave one more time, at the geometry of death that a Kentucky coal miner had scratched into limestone and human flesh. "That's why they're losing this war," he said. "They can't imagine someone like you exists. And by the time they figure it out, it'll be too late." He was right, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Because the real tragedy wasn't what happened in that cave. The real tragedy was what happened when the Japanese High Command heard about it and learned absolutely nothing. The word spreads by nightfall. On October 23rd, every machine gunner in the 24th Infantry Division had heard the story. By October 25th, rifle companies across Leyte were experimenting with ricochet fire. By October 30th, the technique had a name: Bowling's method. It wasn't complicated. That was the beauty of it. You didn't need advanced training. You didn't need special equipment. You just needed to understand that bullets don't disappear. When they hit rock, they redirect. And if you could calculate the angle, you could turn the enemy's cover into their coffin. Machine gunners started studying cave approaches differently, not looking for direct lines of fire, but for hard surfaces at the right angles. Limestone was best, dense enough to redirect without fragmenting the bullet. Granite worked too, even concrete in the ruins of Filipino towns. The results were immediate and devastating. October 24th. A platoon from the 96th Division clears a fortified ridge using ricochet fire. 11 Japanese KIA, 0 American casualties. October 27th. Marines on Peleliu, 100 miles away, hear about the technique and start applying it. Cave complexes that had held up advances for days fall in hours. November 3rd. Army Ordnance issues. Technical Bulletin 43-44. Employment of Ricochet fire in cave warfare. Frank Bolling's improvisation becomes official doctrine. The Americans were doing what they always did. They found something that worked, and they spread it like wildfire. No committees, no months of analysis, no questions about whether it was honorable or proper. It killed the enemy efficiently, so it became standard practice. But in Manila, at the headquarters of the 14th Area Army, the Japanese High Command was receiving very different reports. The fatal misunderstanding. The intelligence summaries coming from Leyte were alarming. Japanese survivors reported bullets that curved through the air or came from the walls. Officers described American secret weapon and new type of ammunition. On November 2, 1944, a classified intelligence brief landed on General Tomoyuki Yamashita's desk. Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, Japan's most respected field commander, read it with growing concern. Multiple reports confirm American forces employing curved trajectory small arms fire, bullets observed changing direction mid-flight, suspected gyroscopic or magnetic guidance system, defensive positions previously considered secure, now vulnerable to indirect fire without artillery support. Yamashita did what any competent commander would do. He issued a warning to all units. Be advised, American forces possess new ammunition technology capable of non-linear flight paths. Conventional cover may be insufficient. Recommend deeper defensive positions and reinforced overhead protection. Notice what's missing from that warning. Any mention of angles, ricochets, or basic physics. The Japanese command interpreted Bolling's technique as a technological advancement, some new American gadget, because that fit their existing worldview. Americans had better technology. That was already assumed. Americans having better tactics, better tactical thinking, better field innovation, that was impossible. So they warned against a weapon that didn't exist and never considered changing the tactics that were getting their men killed. On November 8th, a Japanese engineer officer named Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto read that intelligence brief and immediately understood what was actually happening. Yamamoto had studied civil engineering at Kyoto University before the war. He understood physics. He understood ricochets. And as he read the descriptions of bullets curving through caves, he realized with cold certainty that this wasn't a new weapon. It was geometry. The prophet ignored. Lieutenant Yamamoto spent 3 days writing a detailed report. He included diagrams showing ricochet angles, calculations demonstrating how bullets maintain velocity off hard surfaces, and, most importantly, specific recommendations for countermeasures. The American tactic is not technological, but geometric, he wrote. They are deliberately firing at angles that create ricochets into defensive positions. Countermeasures are simple. Curved tunnel approaches to eliminate straight-line ricochet paths, angled interior walls to deflect ricochets into harmless directions, and repositioning of personnel to avoid perpendicular exposure to hard surfaces. He included sketches. He showed the mathematics. He even calculated the exact angles that needed to be avoided based on common cave configurations. His report was 12 pages long. It was thorough, professional, and absolutely correct. On November 15th, his commanding officer, Major Hideaki Saito, called him into his office. "Lieutenant, I have read your report. Sir, if we implement these changes to defensive positions, we can neutralize..." "Lieutenant," the major's voice was cold, "your report suggests that American soldiers, farmers, and factory workers have developed a tactical innovation that our entire officer corps failed to anticipate." "Sir, it's simply applied physics. Anyone with engineering knowledge. It suggests that our defensive doctrine, developed over decades by the finest military minds in Japan, is flawed. That cave positions we have assured our men are secure are in fact death traps." Yamamoto chose his words carefully. "Sir, I am only suggesting adaptations based on observed enemy tactics." "You are suggesting," Major Saito said, "that we were wrong, that our training was insufficient, that some American coal miner understands warfare better than we do. Sir, I'm suggesting that physics doesn't care about that is enough. The major stood. Lieutenant Yamamoto, you are a capable officer, but you are young and inexperienced in combat. These reports from Lady are exaggerated, likely the result of panic and poor visibility in cave fighting. What you interpret as some geometric tactic is more likely American artillery fragments or grenade shrapnel creating confusion. Sir, the wound patterns are inconsistent with fragmentation. Your report is rejected as speculative and based on insufficient evidence. You will not distribute it further. You will not discuss these theories with other officers. You will focus on your assigned duties. Am I clear? Yes, sir. The report was filed and forgotten. The Japanese defensive doctrine remained unchanged. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto would survive 3 more months. On April 9, 1945, during the battle for Okinawa, he was killed defending a cave complex on the Motobu Peninsula. The American after-action report noted that the position was cleared using Ricochet fire techniques per TB 4344B. He was killed by the tactic he had tried to warn against. His body was found with 17 other soldiers, all with lateral wound patterns, all dead from bullets that had bounced off the limestone walls he'd recommended be redesigned. His 12-page report was discovered in Japanese archives in 1946, stamped Speculative Analysis, Not for Operational Use. The Cascade. But Yamamoto wasn't the only one who paid the price for institutional rigidity. Across the Philippines, Japanese defensive positions continued using the same cave tactics, the same positions that had worked against Chinese forces, the same positions that doctrine prescribed, the same positions that were now killing fields. November 1944, estimated 340 Japanese soldiers killed by Ricochet fire techniques, Leyte campaign. December 1944, the technique spreads to Burma, New Guinea, the Marianas. Anywhere there are caves and hard surfaces. Estimated 680 additional casualties. January 1945. Army Ground Forces publishes Cave Warfare, Lessons from the Pacific Theater. Ricochet fire is now taught at infantry schools. It's no longer improvisation, it's doctrine. And still, the Japanese command learned nothing. Intelligence reports continued to describe American secret weapons. Defensive manuals continued to prescribe cave positions without geometric considerations. Officers who suggested tactical adaptations were quietly reassigned or reprimanded for defeatist thinking. The ideology couldn't bend, so it broke, and men died. By the time Okinawa began in April 1945, American forces had refined ricochet tactics to an art form. They'd added it to pre-assault briefings. They'd developed specialized machine gun positions for optimal ricochet angles. They'd created detailed terrain analysis, specifically identifying good ricochet surfaces. The Japanese defenders on Okinawa had dug the most sophisticated cave networks in the Pacific. Thousands of interconnected tunnels, artillery positions, barracks, all underground, all impregnable. And all designed according to the same doctrine that had been getting men killed for 6 months. The Americans cleared them systematically, mathematically, using techniques pioneered by a Kentucky coal miner who'd never graduated high school. Final casualty estimates from ricochet fire in the Okinawa campaign. Over 2,000 Japanese soldiers, not killed by superior technology, not killed by overwhelming firepower, killed by their own command's refusal to accept that a poor American with a practical education might understand something they didn't. The bitter arithmetic. Let's do the math that the Japanese command never bothered to do. October 23rd, 1944. 1 bullet, fired by Frank Bowling. 19 deaths. November 1944 to May 1945. Estimated 4,200 Japanese soldiers killed by ricochet fire across all Pacific theaters. American casualties during cave assaults, reduced by approximately 40% in engagements where ricochet tactics were employed. Time required to clear fortified positions, reduced by an average of 60%. Number of changes made to Japanese defensive doctrine in response, 0. Number of official Japanese Army analyses acknowledging the tactic, 0. Number of Japanese officers reprimanded or relieved for suggesting doctrinal changes, at least 17 documented cases. Frank Bowling survived the war. He returned to Kentucky, worked construction, raised 3 kids, and rarely talked about what he'd done. His obituary in 1987 mentioned he was a veteran. It didn't mention the innovation that had saved thousands of lives and killed thousands more. The Japanese military was disbanded after the war and completely restructured. The new Japan Self-Defense Force based its entire training philosophy on one principle. Doctrine is a guideline, not gospel. Adaptability is not weakness. Reality is the only teacher that matters. They learned, eventually. But for thousands of men in caves across the Pacific, that lesson came too late. Because the real enemy wasn't American firepower. It wasn't American technology. It wasn't even American soldiers. The real enemy was the absolute certainty that they couldn't possibly learn anything from their enemies. And that certainty killed them more efficiently than any bullet ever could. The final accounting. After the war, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department did what the U.S. Army always does. They studied everything. In 1947, they published a comprehensive analysis titled Small Arms Tactical Innovations, Pacific Theater, 1944 to 1945. Buried in Appendix C was a section on ricochet fire techniques. The numbers were stark. Cave assault operations employing ricochet tactics. 40% reduction in friendly casualties compared to conventional methods. Time to clear fortified positions, reduced by an average of 58%. Ammunition efficiency. 1 round of ricochet fire, statistically equivalent to 3.7 rounds of direct fire in cave environments. Enemy casualties attributable to ricochet techniques, conservatively estimated at 4,200 across all Pacific theaters, November 1944 through August 1945. All of this traced back to one moment, one coal miner, one understanding of physics that no military academy had thought to teach. The study noted Specialist Bowling's innovation was not complex. The principles involved are taught in basic physics courses. The tactical application required only observation and willingness to deviate from prescribed methods. The technique was rapidly adopted and disseminated throughout combat units without formal training infrastructure. Then came the damning sentence, analysis of captured Japanese documents reveals no evidence of tactical counter-adaptation, despite clear awareness of the technique by December 1944. Defensive doctrine remained static throughout the campaign. They knew, they saw it, they documented it. They warned their troops about American curved bullets, and they changed nothing. The Long Shadow. The story doesn't end in 1945. Frank Bowling's technique was taught at infantry schools through the Korean War. It appeared in Army field manuals until the 1960s, when changes in warfare made cave fighting less common. But the principle remained. The terrain isn't just an obstacle. It's a weapon if you understand the physics. Modern close-quarters battle doctrine still includes ricochet considerations. SWAT teams train on hard corner techniques, using angles and ricochets in urban environments. The mathematics are the same. The principle is identical. Reality doesn't care what year it is, but the deeper impact was philosophical. The U.S. military, watching how a random specialist from Kentucky had revolutionized cave warfare in 10 minutes, drew a conclusion. Doctrine is important, but adaptability is essential. The best tactics come from the people doing the fighting, not from the people writing manuals. By 1950, tactical innovation from below was a formal part of U.S. Army training philosophy. Soldiers were encouraged to experiment, to adapt, to think. Junior officers were evaluated partly on their willingness to deviate from doctrine when circumstances demanded it. The Japanese military learned too, but they had to be completely destroyed first. When Japan created the Self-Defense Force in 1954, they built it on a foundation that would have been unthinkable in 1944. Flexibility over rigidity, initiative over obedience, reality over ideology. A 1955 Japanese military training manual, translated by American advisors, included this passage: "The officer who cannot adapt is more dangerous than the enemy. Doctrine is a tool, not a religion. The warrior's first duty is to reality, not to tradition." It was written by officers who had survived the war, who had watched their comrades die in caves because their superiors couldn't accept that an American might be smarter than they were, who had learned, finally, at a cost of millions of lives, that the universe doesn't care about your ideology. The coal miner's legacy. Frank Bowling never became famous. He never wanted to be. After the war, he moved back to Harlan County. He worked construction, then as a mine safety inspector. Ironic, given that his coal mining experience had taught him how to kill thousands of men. He married, had 3 children, 8 grandchildren. He went to church on Sundays. He voted in elections. He lived a quiet, normal life. Occasionally, other veterans would hear his name and make the connection. "Wait, are you the Bowling? The guy with the Ricochet thing?" He'd shrug. "I just did what made sense. Seemed like a waste to aim at rocks, but that's where the angles were." In 1982, a young Army historian tracked him down for an oral history project. She asked him if he'd known, in that moment on October 23, 1944, that he was changing warfare. "Ma'am, I knew I was trying not to get shot. I knew I had a machine gun and some hard rocks and some geometry from the mines. I knew if I aimed right, the bullets would go where I needed them. That's all I knew." But you changed tactical doctrine across an entire theater. "No, ma'am. I just shot at some rocks." Other folks decided what it meant. He died in 1987, age 67, of lung cancer, probably from all those years in the mines, before and after the war. His obituary in the Harlan Daily Enterprise ran 4 paragraphs. It mentioned his military service in 1 sentence. It didn't mention the innovation. It didn't mention the thousands of lives saved or taken. It didn't mention that he'd proven a coal miner could defeat an empire's military doctrine with high school geometry. But in the Army Infantry School at Fort Benning, there's a small plaque in the close quarters battle training facility. It reads, "Specialist Francis Bowling, 24th Infantry Division. October 23, 1944. 1 shot, 19 kills. Innovation over ideology. 19 kills with 1 bullet. Thousands more with 1 idea. An entire military philosophy destroyed by a man who'd never read the manual." The lesson. So what does this mean? Why does this story matter 80 years later? Because October 23, 1944, wasn't just about bullets and caves and dead soldiers. It was about what happens when ideology meets reality. The Japanese military built an entire system on a belief: we are spiritually superior. Therefore, we will win. That belief was so fundamental, so load-bearing, that questioning it meant questioning everything. Their training, their doctrine, their culture, their entire reason for fighting. So when a Kentucky coal miner proved them catastrophically wrong, they couldn't accept it. Not wouldn't, couldn't. To accept that Frank Bowling understood warfare better than they did meant accepting that everything they believed was a lie. It was psychologically impossible. So they rationalized. They invented secret weapons. They dismissed evidence. They silenced officers who saw the truth. They court-martialed the prophets and promoted the ideologues. And they died in caves, killed by physics, while their commanders insisted that spirit would triumph over science. This wasn't stupidity. This was something more dangerous. Intelligence in service of a false premise. The Japanese officers weren't idiots. They were smart men, educated men, experienced men. But they were smart and educated and experienced within a system that punished truth and rewarded conformity. They were brilliant at defending an ideology that was killing them. And here's the thing, they're not unique. How many times have you seen this pattern? How many times have you watched smart people refuse to accept evidence because it contradicts what they need to believe? How many times have you seen systems that punish innovation and reward obedience, even when the obedience is obviously failing? How many times have you seen the modern equivalent of officers warning about curved bullets while refusing to acknowledge that the enemy is just better at geometry? The final truth. Frank Bowling didn't defeat 19 Japanese soldiers on October 23, 1944. He defeated an ideology. He proved that reality doesn't negotiate. Physics doesn't care about your warrior code. Geometry doesn't respect your doctrine. The universe operates on principles that are completely indifferent to what you need to be true. You can be brave, honorable, disciplined, and educated. You can have centuries of tradition, an elite training, and absolute certainty. You can have every psychological and cultural reason to believe you're right. And a coal miner with a basic understanding of angles can still kill you with one bullet. Because when belief collides with reality, reality wins. Every single time. The Japanese learned this lesson, eventually, after hundreds of thousands of deaths, after complete destruction, after their entire system was dismantled and rebuilt from scratch. But some of them never learned. Some of them died in caves, still believing that American soldiers lacked warrior spirit, still believing that innovation was weakness, still believing that the old ways were best, even as the new ways killed them. Lieutenant Yamamoto knew the truth. He wrote it down. He showed the math. And he died anyway, because the system couldn't accept that it was wrong. Colonel Tsuji saw it coming. He warned them. He was ignored. He survived to write bitter memoirs about the catastrophe of certainty. And Frank Bowling? He just aimed at the rocks and pulled the trigger, because he didn't have an ideology to defend. He just had a problem to solve. The choice. So here's the question that matters. When reality contradicts what you believe, when the evidence is clear, when the math is undeniable, when the bodies are piling up in caves, what do you do? Do you adapt? Or do you invent curved bullets to explain away what you can't accept? Do you listen to the prophets? Or do you transfer them and promote the ideologues? Do you learn from the coal miner? Or do you insist that your academy training makes you superior? Because somewhere, right now, There's someone like Frank Bowling, someone without credentials or pedigree, someone who understands reality better than the experts because they're not constrained by what they're supposed to believe. And somewhere, right now, there's someone like Lieutenant Yamamoto, someone who sees the truth and is trying to warn the system, someone who's about to be ignored because the truth is inconvenient. And somewhere, right now, there are people dying in caves, metaphorical or literal, because their leaders can't adapt, won't adapt, refuse to believe that they could possibly be wrong. The question is, which side are you on? October 23rd, 1944. One bullet, 19 deaths, 4,000 more. A military philosophy shattered, an empire humbled. All because one man understood that reality doesn't care what you believe. It only cares what's true. And the truth, as Frank Bowling proved, while aiming at limestone walls in the Philippine jungle, has a way of ricocheting into places you never expected. Sometimes it saves lives, sometimes it takes them, but it always, always wins in the end.